It's funny how a single moment, a seemingly small phrase, can make you rethink everything. One conversation, one offhand remark, and suddenly, your entire world feels different, more distant, more suffocating. That's how it was for me the day my stepmother, Olivia, said those words. It wasn't anything profound, or even particularly malicious at the time, but they stuck with me in a way that I hadn't expected. They became a turning point in my life. A moment when I realized that I wasn't the helpless, grateful child I had been led to believe I was. I had never been close to Olivia. From the moment my father married her, I felt like an outsider in my own home. Sure, I was still living under my father's roof, but after my mother passed away when I was just 10 years old, my world had already been turned upside down. I had always been a quiet, introverted kid, but my mother's death made me even more withdrawn. I spent most of my days in my room, drawing or reading, trying to escape from a reality I didn't know how to deal with. My father, who had always been a quiet man, didn't know how to comfort me. He seemed lost in his own grief, just as I was, and we both learned to live in separate silos of sadness. Then when I was 14, my father remarried. Olivia, who was in her late 30s at the time, came into our lives. She was everything my mother wasn't. My mother had been gentle, warm, always full of quiet strength. Olivia, on the other hand, was loud, brash, and confident in a way that made me uncomfortable. She had her own ideas about how things should be run, and the house quickly began to feel like her domain. She was constantly organizing, constantly telling me what I needed to do, and always with that air of superiority, as if she had it all figured out. At first, I tried to avoid conflict. I stayed in my room and didn't argue. It seemed easier that way. But no matter how much I tried to retreat into my own space, Olivia made sure I couldn't escape. She would knock on my door to remind me about chores, ask why I wasn't downstairs with the family, or scold me for spending too much time alone. I had always been a quiet kid, but in her presence, it felt as though I was being suffocated by expectations I didn't understand. It wasn't even the things she did that bothered me the most. It was the way she made me feel. Like I was nothing but an obligation to her. Something she had to deal with as part of the package deal of marrying my dad. My father didn't seem to notice. Or maybe he just didn't want to see it. After all, Olivia was the woman he chose. And it wasn't like he had been a particularly involved father, even before she came into our lives. It was during one of these moments, one of the many nights I had spent quietly fuming in my room, that I overheard Olivia talking to my dad in the kitchen. They didn't realize I was listening, but I couldn't help but catch the tail end of their conversation. "I don't understand why she's so ungrateful," Olivia said, her voice raised just enough for me to hear from the stairs. "I mean, we're giving her everything. A roof over her head, food on the table. What more does she want?" I froze in place. I could feel the heat rise in my chest, a mix of anger and hurt flooding through me. Ungrateful? I was being called ungrateful for wanting to be treated like a person, for not wanting to be constantly reminded that I should be thankful for the bare minimum. The words stung more than I would have liked to admit. In that moment, it felt like Olivia didn't see me at all. She didn't understand what it felt like to be in my shoes. To be stuck in a house with a woman who didn't want you there. A father who didn't notice. And a life that seemed as though it was being decided for you. That night, I didn't sleep much. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my thoughts racing. Olivia's words echoed in my mind. A roof over your head. She had said it like it was some great gift, like I should be on my knees, thanking her for providing me with the basic necessities of life. But why? Was it such an extraordinary thing to have a safe place to sleep? Wasn't that the bare minimum I should expect from the people who were supposed to love and care for me? I started thinking about what she said in a way that I hadn't before. The more I thought about it, the more it bothered me. Why was I supposed to feel eternally grateful for something that I hadn't asked for? I didn't remember asking for a new mother, or for a woman who seemed to think she had the right to run my life. I had been grateful when my dad remarried, because I thought maybe Olivia could be the mother figure I had lost. But instead, she had become a reminder of what I no longer had. She had become a barrier between me and my father. She had taken my place in his life, and I had become an afterthought. The next day, I avoided her. I stayed in my room longer than usual, hiding from the tension that I knew would follow. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed inside me. I couldn't stop replaying her words in my mind. You should be grateful for the roof over your head. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that I wasn't just being treated unfairly. I was being controlled. The house, the food, the things that I had taken for granted. They were all part of a system where I was expected to remain quiet, to be thankful, and to let things unfold the way Olivia wanted them to. But I wasn't a child anymore. I wasn't the same person who had come into this house 3 years ago, unsure of myself and hesitant to make waves. In that moment, something inside me snapped. I made a decision then and there. If Olivia wanted me to be grateful for a roof over my head, then I would take that roof away from her. If she thought she could control me by reminding me of my supposed dependence on her, I would show her that I didn't need her or the house. The thought terrified me, but it also filled me with a strange sense of power. For the first time in years, I realized I had a choice. I could leave. I didn't have to stay under her control, trapped in a house where I wasn't wanted. But leaving wasn't going to be easy. I had no idea how to break free from everything I had known for the past few years. I was still in high school, and my father would undoubtedly be furious. Olivia would probably have a meltdown, but I didn't care anymore. I couldn't keep living like this. As I spent the next few days processing my thoughts, I started making plans. I wasn't going to just leave in a hasty fit of anger. I had learned to be careful and strategic, and this would require patience. I would need to save money, find a place to stay, and get out of this house in a way that would send a message. In the days that followed, I kept quiet. I kept to myself. But every time Olivia walked into the room and looked at me like I was nothing more than a burden, I knew I was making the right decision. The roof over my head was no longer a gift. It was just a place I was staying until I could finally get out and create a life of my own. I spent the following weeks stewing in my decision, turning it over and over in my mind. The more I thought about it, the more convinced I became that leaving was my only option. But it wasn't going to be easy. I couldn't just storm out in a fit of anger and expect everything to work out. This needed to be done carefully with thought and strategy. If I was going to take that roof away from Olivia, I had to be prepared for what would come next. At first, I was overwhelmed with the logistics. I had to leave. I wanted to leave. But how? I was still a high school student. I had no experience living on my own. No idea what it would take to start over. I wasn't sure if my father would even understand. And if I left without warning, I knew Olivia would make my life hell. She would accuse me of abandoning my family, of being ungrateful, of betraying her. She would spin a narrative that made me look like a villain. I didn't want to give her the satisfaction of seeing me suffer, but I also didn't want to be stuck in this toxic environment for one more day. The first thing I had to do was figure out where I could go. I was 17, not old enough to rent an apartment on my own without a cosigner. That was a problem I had to solve. I couldn't rely on my dad for help, since he was so wrapped up in his marriage to Olivia that I knew he would take her side, no matter what. And my mother's side of the family, while well-meaning, was scattered across the country. They would never understand why I wanted to leave home so badly. No, if I was going to do this, I had to do it alone. I needed to find a place that was affordable, even if it was small and barely livable at first. I couldn't afford luxury, but I didn't care. I just wanted to be free. I started looking for apartments online, spending hours on my phone during the quiet moments when no one was looking. I found a few places within my budget, a couple of small studio apartments in a less than desirable part of town. They weren't ideal, but they were a start. I could make them work. The next step was to figure out how I was going to pay for them. I had been working part-time at a local cafe since I was 16, saving every dollar I could. The job wasn't glamorous, but it paid enough to cover my basic needs. I didn't have much saved, but it was a start. Every paycheck that came in, I set aside a chunk of it. I wasn't sure how much I needed, but I estimated that a couple of $1,000s would get me through the first month or two, at least until I could find something more permanent. I had to be frugal and resourceful. The real challenge came in the form of logistics. I had to figure out how to leave without anyone noticing. I couldn't just pack up and leave when my dad and Olivia were around. They would have questions, and I wasn't ready for the confrontation yet. I needed to be prepared. I needed to plan my exit. It was around this time that I had an idea that both terrified and excited me. I decided to start packing in secret. Every day, I would sneak into the basement or my closet and begin packing a bag or two with essentials: clothes, toiletries, a few books, and my most prized possessions. It was a slow process, but it gave me a sense of control. I was in the driver's seat for the first time in years. Every time I put an item in my bag, I felt a little more empowered. It was as though I was reclaiming my life, one small thing at a time. I couldn't take everything, of course. My dad would notice if I suddenly disappeared with all my things. And I didn't want to raise any alarms. But I didn't need everything. I could start over with just the basics. The rest of my stuff, my childhood memories, my family photos, things I had collected over the years, I left behind. I had to let go of them. I couldn't carry the weight of my old life with me into the future. Meanwhile, Olivia had no idea what was happening. I kept up appearances, pretending everything was normal. I still did my chores, still ate dinner with them, still listened to her long lectures about how I should be more grateful for what I had. But it was all a facade. Inside, I was preparing to walk away from it all. One afternoon, I came across a small advertisement for a studio apartment that seemed to meet my needs. It was in a rundown building on the edge of town, not far from my high school. It wasn't anything fancy, but it had potential. The rent was low enough that I could afford it with my savings, and it seemed like a decent place to start. The building was old and the neighborhood wasn't great, but I didn't care. All I needed was a roof over my head, a place to sleep, and a space to figure out my next move. I called the landlord the next day. Her name was Miss Thomas, and she seemed friendly enough on the phone. She didn't ask many questions, which was a relief. She told me the apartment was available, and that I could come by to see it whenever I wanted. I made plans to meet her the following weekend. The idea of actually seeing the place in person made my heart race. I was getting closer. As the days passed, I continued packing in secret. I didn't tell anyone about the apartment, about my plans, about anything. It felt like I was living a double life, sneaking around like a criminal. But the more I did it, the more I realized that I wasn't doing anything wrong. I wasn't running away from my problems, I was taking control of my own life. Something I had never been able to do before. The day I went to see the apartment was both exhilarating and nerve-wracking. Miss Thomas met me at the building and led me up 2 flights of stairs to the small unit. It was exactly what I had expected. Small, a bit grimy, but with enough potential to be livable. The floors creaked under my feet, and the walls needed a fresh coat of paint. But the rent was cheap, and it felt like my only option. I told Miss Thomas I'd take it, and she handed me the keys without a second thought. Now that I had a place, the next step was to figure out when I could leave. I didn't want to wait too long. I didn't want to give Olivia or my dad any chance to stop me. But at the same time, I didn't want to make any rash decisions. I had to think this through carefully. I decided I would leave in the middle of the week, when my dad was at work and Olivia was busy with her errands. It would be a clean break, with no one to stop me. I spent the next few days packing up the rest of my belongings, making sure everything was ready. I knew it would be hard, and I knew my dad would be hurt. But it wasn't about him anymore. It was about me. I had been a passive observer in my own life for too long. Now I was ready to take charge. As the days ticked down to my departure, I couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to change. I would no longer be the quiet, passive child that Olivia and my father thought I was. I was going to be my own person, and I couldn't wait to see what would happen next. I didn't know how everything would unfold once I left, but I knew that no matter what happened, I would never have to hear Olivia's voice again, telling me to be grateful for the roof over my head. Because in the end I was going to take that roof and my freedom away from her. It wasn't going to be easy, but it was going to be worth it. The day I left felt like the longest day of my life. It was a Wednesday, and I had planned everything down to the last detail. The apartment was ready, the packing was done, and now I just had to execute it. My heart raced as I prepared for the final steps of my escape. This wasn't just about moving out. This was about reclaiming my life, about proving to Olivia and my father that I could make it on my own. It was the hardest thing I'd ever done, but it also felt like the only choice I had left. I woke up early, like I had on so many days before, but today was different. There was an electricity in the air, a sense of finality. Olivia was already in the kitchen, humming to herself as she prepared breakfast. I could hear the clink of plates and utensils as she set the table. She didn't know that in a few hours, everything would change. I dressed in my oldest clothes, ones I wouldn't mind leaving behind, and made sure my hair was tied back and neat. I wanted to leave without any fanfare, without any fuss. I didn't want her to see the doubt in my eyes, or the uncertainty in my heart. The truth was I was terrified. Leaving home at 17, with no one but myself to rely on, felt like a leap into the unknown. But it was a leap I had to take. The house was quiet, except for the sounds of Olivia in the kitchen. I took a deep breath and walked downstairs. My dad's car was still in the driveway, but he would be leaving for work soon. Olivia was busy as usual, so I knew I had time before either of them would notice I was gone. I tried to ignore the knot in my stomach as I entered the kitchen. Olivia looked up at me and smiled, as if everything was fine. "Good morning, sweetie," she said cheerfully. "Breakfast is ready." I smiled weakly, nodding in response. "Thanks, but I'm not hungry. I'm just going to grab a quick coffee." She didn't think anything of it. She never did. To her, I was just a passive presence in the house, someone who didn't make waves, someone who stayed out of her way. Little did she know I was about to make the biggest wave of all. I moved to the counter and poured myself a cup of coffee, my hands shaking slightly as I did. The weight of what I was about to do was heavy on my chest, but I knew it was the right thing. I couldn't stay in that house one more day. Not under her thumb. Not living a life that wasn't mine to live. After a few moments, I set the coffee cup down and walked back upstairs. I had packed up most of my things the night before, and now all I had to do was grab a few final items. I walked to my closet and quickly stuffed my clothes into a large duffel bag. I didn't take everything. I left behind the things I knew I could do without. Old toys, extra books, things that felt like they belonged to another version of myself. I had to move fast. I couldn't waste time. Every second I spent hesitating felt like a second I was losing control over my own life. My phone buzzed with a text from my dad. He said he'd be working late today, so I knew I had a few hours of freedom before he'd come home and notice anything was wrong. Once I had everything packed, I quickly looked around my room, taking one last glance at the familiar surroundings. I had spent so many years in that room, growing up grieving, living in a place that felt more like a prison than a home. But now it was time to leave it all behind. I was taking nothing with me but the bare essentials. With my bag in hand, I carefully made my way down the stairs, trying not to make a sound. Olivia was still in the kitchen, and the last thing I needed was for her to catch me before I could slip out. As I reached the front door, I felt a pang of guilt in my chest. I wasn't leaving with any formal goodbyes, no heartfelt explanations. But I didn't have the words to make her understand. She wouldn't care, not really. She would never understand the reasons behind my departure. To her, I was just a difficult, ungrateful child. Someone who was throwing away a roof over my head. She would probably never realize how suffocating that roof had become. I opened the door quietly and stepped outside, the cool morning air hitting my face like a slap. It felt surreal, like I was stepping out of one world and into another. The world I was leaving behind was filled with expectations, demands, and unspoken rules. But the world ahead of me, well, I didn't know what that would be, but I knew it was mine. I walked quickly to my car, my heart pounding in my chest. The drive to the apartment felt long, but in reality, it was only about 20 minutes. As I navigated the familiar streets, my mind raced with thoughts. What would my dad say when he came home and saw that I was gone? Would Olivia call the police? Would anyone care that I was leaving? But no matter how much I questioned myself, I knew I couldn't go back. Not now. I had made my decision, and I had to live with it. I had to take responsibility for my own life, for the future I wanted to build. And I couldn't do that while I was still under their roof. When I arrived at the building, I took a moment to collect myself. I stared up at the worn-down exterior of the building, the chipped paint and cracked windows giving it a sense of decay. It wasn't much, but it was mine. I could already picture myself in that tiny apartment, finding my rhythm, figuring out how to make it work. I parked in the lot behind the building and grabbed my duffel bag from the passenger seat. I took a deep breath before I walked inside, my footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. The apartment door was unlocked, just as Miss Thomas had promised. I stepped inside, the smell of old carpet and dust greeting me. It wasn't much, but it was clean enough, and it felt like the first place in years where I could breathe. I set my things down in the corner of the room and looked around. The apartment had a small kitchenette, a couch that had seen better days, and a narrow bedroom with a single bed. It wasn't luxurious, but it was a space that was all mine. It was small and bare, but that didn't matter. I could make it a home. I could make it work. The silence in the apartment was strange at first. It felt like I had entered another world, one that didn't have to deal with the constant tension of my father and Olivia's household. There was no one here to judge me, to criticize me, to make me feel small. This was my space, and I could fill it with whatever I wanted. As the hours passed, I unpacked a few of my things, settling into the apartment the best I could. It wasn't easy, and I missed the comfort of my old life, even if it had been suffocating. But as the night drew closer, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: peace. I wasn't sure how long I would stay in this apartment, or how I would manage on my own. But for the first time in years, I felt free. Later that evening, I received a text from my dad asking if I was okay. I knew he wouldn't understand what I had done, but I didn't have the strength to respond. I wasn't ready to explain myself, not yet. I couldn't go back, not now that I had finally taken control of my life. The next few days were a blur of adjusting to my new routine. I started attending school again, going to work, and making my new apartment feel like home. It wasn't easy, and there were moments when the loneliness crept in, but I knew this was the price I had to pay for my independence. I had made my choice, and now I had to live with it. The move had been the hardest thing I had ever done, but in the end it was worth it. I had taken the roof away from Olivia. I had taken my life back. And I was finally free. The days following my move felt like a blur. I wasn't sure what I had expected, but I certainly wasn't prepared for the isolation I felt. It was one thing to leave the suffocating atmosphere of my father's house, to break free from Olivia's dominance, but the loneliness that came with living on my own was more intense than I had anticipated. I would lie awake at night in the small apartment, staring at the ceiling, wondering if I had made the right choice. For the first few days, I kept to myself. I went to work, went to school, and returned to my apartment, where I tried to settle into my new life. The routine felt alien at first, and my thoughts would often drift back to the life I had left behind. The absence of my father, of my childhood home, haunted me. But despite the discomfort, the sense of relief that washed over me each time I crossed the threshold of my apartment was undeniable. I was on my own, free from the oppressive presence of Olivia. No one was there to tell me what I should do or who I should be. It was terrifying, yes, but also liberating. And yet, in the midst of my newfound freedom, the world I had abandoned still felt close. Too close. My phone buzzed one evening with a message from my father. I hadn't heard from him directly since I left, but I knew this moment would come. "We need to talk. Olivia is worried about you. Please come home." I stared at the message for a while, the words hanging in the air, feeling heavier with each passing second. Olivia was worried about me? It felt almost laughable. In the years I had lived under her roof, she had never once worried about how I felt. To her, I was just a burden, a nuisance. The only thing she worried about was maintaining control over my life, keeping me in line with her expectations. Now she was worried? What a joke. But despite my anger and bitterness, a small part of me felt a pang of guilt. Was this really the right thing to do? I had made the decision to leave, to stand up for myself, but now that I was alone, the weight of my actions was sinking in. I hadn't expected it to feel this lonely. I hadn't expected to feel this uncertain. I didn't respond to my father's message immediately. Instead, I tried to keep busy, work, school, anything to distract myself from the guilt that gnawed at my insides. But as the days passed, I knew that I couldn't avoid this forever. I had left, And now I had to face the consequences of that choice. I couldn't run from it, no matter how much I wanted to. One evening, after another long day of classes and work, I found myself sitting on the worn-out couch in my apartment, staring at my phone. I hadn't heard from my father in a while, but I knew that sooner or later, the pressure would build, and he would try to reach me again. I wondered what he thought. Did he understand why I had left? Or was he just angry and confused, unwilling to see my side of things? Just as I was about to put the phone down, it rang. My heart skipped a beat when I saw the name on the screen. It was him, my father. I took a deep breath before answering. "Dad," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "what's going on?" There was a long pause before he spoke, and when he did, his voice was softer than I expected. "I'm just trying to understand, kid," he said, his tone strained. "Olivia's upset. You can't just disappear like that and not expect people to worry." "I didn't disappear," I replied, my voice sharper than I intended. "I just left. I couldn't take it anymore. I'm not a kid anymore, Dad. I'm not going to sit in that house and pretend everything's okay when it's not." I heard him sigh heavily on the other end of the line. It was clear that he didn't fully understand. "Look, I don't know what's going on in your head, but you can't just cut us off like that. Olivia's been really worried. I'm worried too." I felt my anger start to rise. "You're worried? You never worried about me before. Not when she treated me like I was invisible. Not when she made me feel like I was nothing. Now you're worried?" There was a long pause before he spoke again, and when he did, his voice was quieter. "I don't know what's going on, but I'm your father. You can't just leave and expect me to be okay with it. You need to come home." I didn't know what to say. I wanted to scream at him, tell him that I was done, that I didn't need to be in that house anymore. But at the same time, I could hear the worry in his voice, the fear that he had somehow failed me as a parent. "I can't," I said softly. "I can't go back there. I'm sorry, but I just can't." Another long silence followed before he spoke again. "All right. I don't know what you want from me, but I guess you've made your decision. Just know that I'm here if you change your mind." I hung up the phone and stared at the screen for a moment, feeling a mix of anger, sadness, and confusion. I had done what I needed to do, what I felt was right, but now that it was over, I wasn't sure where I stood with my father. He hadn't supported me when I was still living at home, but now, after I had left, it was clear that he wasn't sure how to handle this new version of me. Days turned into weeks, and my life slowly settled into a new routine. I continued going to work and school, making a meager living, getting by. The loneliness didn't seem to go away, but I was learning to live with it. I was learning how to be okay on my own. But even as I grew more comfortable in my new life, the phone calls and messages from my father continued. Olivia kept reaching out, telling me that I was welcome to come back home if I changed my mind. But I didn't respond. I couldn't. I had to keep moving forward. Then one evening, several weeks after I had left, I received a message that shook me to my core. It was from my father. "Olivia is really upset. She says she can't keep living like this. She's been crying every day. Please, can we just talk?" I stared at the message, a mix of guilt and anger rising within me. What did Olivia want from me now? Was she really trying to make me feel responsible for her unhappiness? Was this her way of manipulating me into coming back? I didn't know what to do. I couldn't go back, not to that house, not to that life. I had made my decision, and despite the guilt that gnawed at me, I wasn't going to let Olivia use me as her emotional crutch. And yet, I realized that my decision to leave wasn't just about breaking free from her. It was about finding my own strength. I didn't need to go back to her, to my father, or to that toxic household. I had already proven to myself that I could make it on my own. The guilt would never fully disappear. But as I stood at the threshold of my new life, I understood something important. I couldn't keep sacrificing myself for other people's happiness. I had to be true to myself. I had to keep moving forward, even if it meant leaving the past behind. I took a deep breath, closed my eyes, and made the decision to let go. I was no longer that helpless teenager. I was no longer under Olivia's control. I was free. And that freedom, no matter how difficult, was something I would never give up. The next morning, I packed up my things again, just a few clothes and some essentials, and headed out to start a new chapter. I didn't know exactly where I was going, But for the first time in my life, I felt ready to face whatever came next. The past was behind me. I had taken the roof away, and now I was finally standing on my own. And that, I realized, was the greatest victory of all. The future was mine.